Hey, this is Nick Milivoy.
And this is Jason Shadrick.
And this is the 100 Guitarist podcast, where every week we are here to tell you about one of the 100 guitar players that we think you should know about. Today we have a very big episode.
Woo!
Because
this might be the one. This might be the one you need to know about.
We are talking about the great, undeniably one of the greatest guitar players of all time, Jeff Beck. And we have a very special guest here to talk about Jeff Beck, who's so close, probably the closest guitar player to his playing, who's worked with Jeff, and that is Jennifer Batten. Would you agree with that, Jason?
I would agree.
Before we bring Jennifer on and before we start talking about Jeff, we want to remind you that you can like, subscribe, rate, and review us anywhere you find podcasts or are watching this video, which would be on YouTube. Help us out. We love that. And tell everybody what you think. Tell everybody about the podcast. And tell us what you think. Hit us up. Get at us at 100guitarists at premierguitar.com. Text, phone calls, voicemails. We don't answer the phone. You won't get somebody on the other end of the line. Just leave voicemail at 319-423-9734, and you might end up on a future episode of the 100 Guitarists podcast.
That's right. And today's episode is brought to you by Fender, and specifically the Fender Player 2 series, which includes all new Vital versions of the most iconic models with contemporary upgrades, including a comfortable modern C-neck, smooth rolled edges, the return of rosewood fingerboards. I want a t-shirt that says rosewood returns. And new vintage colors under from the vaults. And if you go to fender.com, anything over $50, free shipping.
And since this is the Jeff Beck episode, I want to talk about the 2024 Player 2 Stratocaster. And like you just said, it has that comfortable modern C neck with the rolled edges. It also has classic ear tuners, which offer rock solid performance. And of course, a rosewood fingerboard. All right, Jason.
Yes.
Let's talk about Jeff for a minute before we bring Jennifer on.
All-time great. All-time great. Yeah, I didn't get Jeff Beck until I saw him live.
Okay, well, I've never seen him live, so maybe I don't get Jeff Beck. I think I get Jeff Beck. I would call myself a Jeff Beck fan.
Yeah.
But I wish I would have seen him live.
If you would have seen him live, you've been like, holy cow. And so I saw him maybe 4 or 5 times, and he always got better. And I know that's a cliche to say. I think there might be 2 or 3 guitar players on the planet who every time you see them, they get better as a player, as with their tone, with everything, which tells me that he never fully realized his potential, as great as he was. Interesting. He never fully realized his potential. He was that good. That good.
Yeah, there's, going through, since I don't have that live experience, I can only talk about his discography. But going through his body of work, it changes so much. Like, I love Jeff's playing in the Yardbirds. It's next level blues rock guitar playing. And to come from that time and be so innovative, and his vocabulary is so deep and so established already. He was a young guy in his early 20s, and it's mind-blowing. And if he just stopped there, he could have had his whole career sounding like that. But then the 70s come along, and he sounds so different again. And then the 80s, he'd always shifted and always grew. And I am so impressed by that. I really do wish I got to see him live. What's the first Jeff Beck you heard?
Probably the Who Else record.
Oh, okay.
Because I was hanging around this guitar store, Davenport, Iowa. Chris, the guy who worked there, would always talk. I just hear people. It was the era where, like, on a Saturday, a bunch of people just go and hang out at a guitar store. None of us intend to buy anything.
Yeah, I missed that.
We're just going to hang out and play guitar and talk with our guitar buddies. And I was, my mom would like drop me off almost at first for a little while. And I just had people talking about Jeff Beck. And I'd see his name in guitar magazines, And in kind of the mid to late 90s, he wasn't doing a whole lot. That was kind of a dormant period, let's say. I think because it was like the Rockabilly record because what Guitar Shop was 89, the Rockabilly record that Jennifer talks about, was in the early 90s.
Mhm.
And then the Who Else is, Crazy Legs was 93, and then Who Else came out in 99. So that was the first, Who Else was the first album released in my lifetime that I kind of heard in real time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I was aware of it when it came out, and it was like, oh, you got to check this out. And it was very techno electronica driven. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? Like, is this the same guy? Right?
Yeah.
Because then they would play me, Cause We've Ended as Lovers. They'd play me Yardbird stuff. And I'm like, this is the same dude? You sure? Right? And then, so he goes out on this tour, and all the buzz is about, oh, Jennifer Batten's in his band. Holy cow, Jennifer Batten. Who's Jennifer Batten? I don't know. And then Chris here at the guitar store is like, hey, we're going to rent like a large cargo van or whatever. And there's like 15 or 20 of us. We're going to drive up to, if everybody chips in $40, we can all drive up to Chicago. It's about a 3-hour drive, go to the show, come back that night. Nobody has to worry about driving, right? I'm like, all right, let's in. Ask my parents, I was like, yeah. So I was a senior in high school when this happened. This was like my first like real out of town concert. And I mentioned it to Jennifer in the thing, but it was world changing. I was like, oh,
yeah, I bet.
That's that same day I saw Jeff Beck. I heard A Day in the Life for the first time. And it was the first time I actually saw somebody smoking weed. All on the same day. That should be a national holiday that day. And, but yeah, that left me with like, I remember a singer-songwriter named Paul Thorne opened for him. It was just a guy, singer-songwriter guy.
No way.
Yep.
That's a
I'm
weird.
like, wow, that was an unusual mix.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. I was like, that's
awesome.
It. He's the guy. He's the
so
man.
my first encounter with Jeff Beck was the first time I heard him was that I think my jazz band teacher in high school told me he'd played on Stevie Wonder records, and then I realized that he played on Talking Book on the song Looking for Another Pure Love. So that would have been the first time I actually like heard a Jeff Beck track. But similarly to you, my real first exposure beyond that guest spot, which is fantastic, was from a guitar store that I worked at. So I was probably 16 or 17 years old. And at that time, my job was like hanging out at the counter, selling stuff, ringing people up, tuning guitars, setting up guitars, restringing guitars, stuff like that. And the owner would often just put on like one CD. This is, in the pre-streaming era, and also pre-multi CD changer era. Just like there was like a CD boombox. It was actually a Fender Bose boombox. That was like a promotional dealer item that would sit there on one of the guitar racks and just had Blow by Blow in there for weeks. And you know what? I never got sick of it. To me, I remember I was a huge Herbie Hancock fan. And when I finally heard that, I was like, wait, this is what Jeff Beck sounds like? I knew he was in the Yardbirds, and I didn't know his playing in the Yardbirds, but I knew like Clapton playing in the Yardbirds. And that era of Yardbirds. And so I just had this idea of what Jeff Beck sounded like. And then I heard Blow by Blow, and to me, it kind of sounded like Headhunters. And, that 70s funk jazz thing. And I loved it. And I just listened to that album so many times while I was stringing up people's guitars. And, but nobody at the store that I worked at arranged a road trip to go see Jeff Beck. Well, all right. That is our Jeff Beck origin stories, and needless to say, we were both fans. And but we're going to bring in Jennifer now to give us some insight on her time working in Jeff Beck's band and what Jeff Beck's playing has meant for her. All right, Jennifer. Well, thank you for being here today on the 100 Guitarist podcast to talk about Jeff Beck.
Sure.
We know you're about to, as we record this, you're about to go on tour, and you squeezed us in. And we really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad it worked out.
So I see a couple pictures behind you
Yeah.
of Jeff. I imagine you didn't just put them there for the podcast.
No, I've had pictures of Jeff up since I was 13, I think. They
So
just get updated.
before we even talk about the two of you working together, just to paint the picture, to set the tone, if that's the case, can you tell us about when you first heard Jeff's music and what it meant to you and what it meant to you as a guitar player?
I guess it's gone in phases. The first time I heard him, I'm guessing, would be in the 70s on the radio, because they're playing blow by blow instrumentals on the radio, which was pretty unusual at that time. Well, it's unusual for any rock radio to have instrumentals, so
Right.
that just speaks to how powerful it was. And my next memory is jamming along with Rough and Ready at a college after party. um, and then fast forward, well, I got the Blow by Blow record, and I was working in a record store when Wired came out. And I remember every day I'd go, the mail is almost here. The truck is delivering records. And Wired came out, and I remember putting it on immediately and being a little disappointed because I wanted Blow by Part 2.
Yeah.
There's different players, different writers, and different sound. And it took me a little bit to get used to it. And now it's one of my two faves, of course. And then fast forward from there, geez, there's so many segments of Beck memories leading up to when I actually met him. But prior to that, I decided, well, I went to Musicians Institute, which was just guitar at that time, and we all had a thing that we had to do to transcribe a tune and solo and play it live. And Steve Lynch, who ended up in the band Autograph after that, did "'Cause We Ended as Lovers" from Blow by Blow. And everybody else was trying to be a jazz bow, and Steve was like, nope, I'm digging in my heels, and this is where I'm at. And I fucking loved it. Excuse my potty mouth. And that influenced me. And not long after I graduated, I dug into that record and Wired, and I learned every tune and even some of the bass parts. I would play along with the records. And long before tributes were a thing, I thought, man, I'm gonna do this live. So I learned everything, and then I got scared and never did it. But
Oh, wow.
yeah,
There's still time. There's still time.
yeah.
That's awesome, though. Just like I feel like, I think about the records that I like really learned all the parts to, and it's like those things just stick with you and they just get in your hands, and it doesn't matter if you ever performed it or not. It's like it's
That's
with you
cool.
now.
Yeah, man. That is university.
That's awesome.
Years ago, Jennifer, we were talking with Dweezil Zapp about Van Halen for his podcast, and you had mentioned you had these like collection of Van Halen transcripts that you did, like 1984 and that stuff. So when you got into this, did you do like a similar phase with Jeff's playing when you started to get into it, where you kind of went through a real transcription, learning note by note phrase? Was that kind of your process for getting into this music?
I may have written a few things down, but no, I didn't write it. Well, the Van Halen thing, I had a book deal. I already had a book out with REH Publications, and I think they contacted me to do a book for 1984. I'm not sure, but I wrote it all out, and then I turned it in, and the guy goes, well, do you know anybody in Van Halen's camp? Because we got to get permission. And I'm like, no. I did my part. Now you do yours. And it never went anywhere. So,
wow.
But goddamn, I mean, that is not easy stuff to write out, man. I mean,
No.
Eddie would do groups of 9 and 13 and somehow land on his feet. And I'd be going like 1 E and how many 16ths are between each one of these?
So what's when I first started getting into Jeff Beck, it was the Guitar Shop record.
Yeah.
And there were some points on that record where I'm like, and I was a pretty novice guitar player, but where I couldn't even picture physically what he was doing on the guitar, because I knew it was a guitar, obviously, but and he was making these sounds that I couldn't even imagine how his hands would even look on the instrument to do it. Did you feel like you had when you started getting into his music, did you feel like you had a similar experience where you're like, how is he getting these notes out of this instrument that I am also playing as well?
Yeah, well, the Guitar Shop record is when he started getting into playing melodies with harmonics. So the stuff I took off was prior to that, and the stuff that stumped me was sounds. I remember the first time he used a ring modulator, and I did not understand what that was. I didn't know that you can actually buy a pedal that would do that. And so I was just trying to, rake the strings to try to get harmonics to come out to match it, and it was hopeless. But other than that, I just matched his notes, and I'm sure a lot of it was not on the same strings or hit the same way for sure.
All right. Do you remember the first time you saw him live?
Yes, yeah. It was the There and Back tour at San Diego State University, and I was pretty far back in the crowd, but it was like going to church. And I have such remorse that I never saw Blow by Blow and Wired tours,
Mm.
and especially with Jan.
Oh yeah.
So were those records, the Blow by Blow Wired, was that era, was that kind of, looking back, is that kind of the part of his discography you gravitate towards the most?
Yeah, that I listened to that stuff thousands of times and cemented it in my brain. And then I thought, okay, There and Back is out. Let me start digging into that. And I think I started working with the final piece or something. And oh my God, it was like a 5-minute solo. And I just gave up. I go, man, I'm just burnt at this point.
So when was the first time that you met Jeff?
It was on the Dangerous tour, 1992, and Michael
Okay.
Jackson was playing Wembley Stadium, and there was a keyboard player on the Bad tour that had done teching for Jeff and Jan when they were touring, and he knew I was so into Jeff, and he said, "Man, you're into him, I'll connect you guys," and he never did, bastard. So it was like my mission of the Dangerous tour. I mean, thank you, Michael, for taking me around the world, but I want to meet Jeff.
Oh wow.
And every show that we did, there was always Sony reps that would be hanging out afterwards, and I would ask them if anybody had a connection to Jeff. I wanted to get him to a show, and somebody came through eventually and invited him to Wembley. And 2 opening acts went on, and then Michael canceled, and I was just absolutely devastated. It was the biggest day of my life, and it turns out Jeff showed up at the last minute, like ripping in with his Corvette, and he was turned away at the gate because they had announced that it was over. And so I called him up and said, "Man, I don't know when or if they're going to make up the show, but can I meet you anyway?" And he said, "Sure." So I went to the studio. He was recording his Rockabilly record the next day.
Wow.
Townhouse Studios. Yeah. Took a London black cabbie to get there. And I had one of those old school video cameras. It was before smartphones, this big honking thing. And of course, I didn't charge the battery, so I got about 5 seconds of gold, and that was it. But it was just stunning to be in the room where he was recording. I remember being super
And they were
shocked.
actively recording. Like it was during a session.
Yeah. And I was absolutely shocked because he was, doing Gene Vincent music, and it did not sound like him. Because he spent time listening to those records as a teen, and that's what the record was.
God, he sounds so much like Cliff Gallup on those too.
Oh yeah,
like it's unbelievable how much he can put that on. Right?
You
that must have been crazy to see that and not know
how he can capture anybody's sound. I've heard him do Hendrix. He was spoofing one day doing Keith Richards, and he did the thing with the shoulder and the whole thing, and talked about how he's got fishing tackle in his hair, and plays a Stones tune. And if you had blindfolds on, you would think Keith's in the room.
Oh,
so
man.
he was so sensitive to the details of what he heard that he could pull that off. Yeah, I'm going off the rails. Where were we?
Oh no.
So you met him in the studio while he was making the Rockabilly record.
And then we hung out afterwards, and luckily I had a couple friends with me, because although I know his music so well, I didn't know him personally at all. Because I mean, before the internet was really a raging thing and everybody had high speed, you could only get information from radio interviews, which I remember setting my watch and staying up to hear it because it wasn't archived, and going to boutique record shops and looking up English magazines to try to get some information. So it took a while to crack the ice, but I could tell he was a comedian already because he was super comfortable and just, it was fun. And then I got my autograph, and he ended up driving me back to my hotel in his Corvette, which was like driving with goddamn Batman.
Yeah.
It's like, boom. I thought, man, if I'm gonna die in a fiery car crash, this is a rock and roll way to go. I thought I would never hear from him again, and he called a couple months later because I had given him a copy of my first CD that just came out, and a copy of the MTV over there played a video that I did for Flight of the Bumblebee, and I did an interview that was on video also. So I gave him my offerings, I got my autograph, and went on my way. But he called up and said, I just finally had a chance to listen to your record, and let's record together. And I, of course, just peed my pants because that was the last thing in the world I expected. So, and it was actually 5 years later before it happened. And I saw him several times backstage after tours. He did a double bill with Santana and some other tour. And he finally called and said, hey, I got a tour of Italy booked. Let's go. And it just blew my mind that he was just going on the faith of, at that time, I had also connected with him on the Dangerous tour, or maybe the History tour. I had another record out by then. And I thought, man, we've never played together, and you're just hiring me. How does this work?
You never sat with guitars
No.
before that.
And I thought, I didn't tell anybody that I was up for the gig because I thought, man, I don't want to jinx it. And we haven't played together. This could go south in a hurry. And I had a session booked in Milan. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to be on that side of the pond. Let me book a trip to London. And I learned most of the Guitar Shop record and went to his house and started playing it for him. And after 3 or 4 songs, he started joining in. And Lord have mercy, his wife brought out the whiskey about midnight, and I had to fly out the next day, and it wasn't good. I had a session the next day in Milan, and Jesus Christ, I was damaged. But I mean, when Jeff Beck offers you whiskey, you don't turn it down, and I did not.
So obviously you got the gig.
Yeah, it worked out well. And I will say that on the way to the first rehearsal, I think the band all met up at Jeff's house. His manager, Ralph Baker, was driving me down and announced that in Jeff's bands, the keyboard player is the musical director. And since I was triggering synthesizer, I was it. That's how I found out I was it. I'm freaking out going, I don't even know if I'll last a day, never mind being the musical director of this thing. But it turns out he was just like a 6-year-old in a sandbox, and he just wanted to play and have fun, and it obviously worked out.
So after all that time spending listening to his music over the years, there are probably some certain things that you were only able to pick up when you're sitting 3 feet from him instead of in a big concert setting and you're at the back of the room. Sure. What did you kind of notice as a guitarist when you were sitting right in front of him and you guys start playing together? What jumped out at you?
You know what? It was like 10 seconds in that studio, that first time I met him in the studio, where I asked him to play Blue Wind. I had learned all those solos and all those tunes, and I saw that he was doing these half-step bends where I wasn't. I was playing the notes, but it didn't sound like him because I wasn't doing these subtle bends. And that's just the world exploded and sent me in a whole new direction. I'm sure there's lots of stuff I picked up being with him, but typically at rehearsals we were faced as we were for a concert. So he was faced to the front and I was faced to the front. So I typically didn't see his hands. But I will tell you, man, I remember one time at rehearsal, I was so into what he was doing that I lost my shit. I was the audience member and I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. So ever since then, I had to change how I would listen to him in I would listen to balls of energy instead of individual notes so I could concentrate on what I was doing. Hard to explain, but yeah.
No, I get it, because it's like it's like zooming in on it's like if you zoomed in too much, it probably just got distracting to hear every little nuance and like
Yeah.
in his playing and in everything about what he's doing after you've analyzed it for so much of your life.
Yeah, my brain was not big enough to do both at the same time. So I saw him a lot. After that 3-year period, I would go see every tour he did and sometimes multiple dates. And then when I'm in the audience, that's a whole different world of intake.
So after that Italy tour and everything starts really working out, when did you start really digging into the Who Else record with him?
Actually, the Italy tour was designed to work out those tunes and then go into the studio, because he had recorded a bunch of stuff with Steve Lukather at Steakhouse Studios, and Jeff wanted to go into a electronica direction, and Steve didn't, and so Jeff shelved all that stuff. There's some great stuff there, but he's quirky and he's always nervous about putting out records. So anyway, the record company was pressuring him, and so he had to cough up something. So uh, Hymas wrote a bunch of stuff, and we went out on the road and worked some stuff out, and then came back in the studio and recorded Who Else, all that new stuff.
So those tunes, were they in place for that Italy tour, or did they really kind of get fleshed out after you got back?
I think both.
Okay.
I mean, this is 20 years ago, but I have a memory of doing, I think, What Mama Said, and you would not recognize the tune that we did live versus studio, because I thought that was the most bizarre tune ever, because it sounded like a Santana track, almost Latin. And I go, man, this doesn't sound like Jeff. And sure enough, it got completely changed. A lot of stuff got changed along the way. So yeah, it got fleshed out in the studio as well.
You have a co-writing credit on What Mama Said. What was the can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was just a case of synchronicity and timing. I was playing that tapping thing that starts it off. That's like, it's almost like a sequencer, but played tapping, a repetitive thing. And Tony Hymas, I was in the studio in Jeff's house studio, and Tony Hymas walked up the stairs and was listening to that as I was playing it, and he goes, "Oh, that sounds interesting." And so, boom, that's in the tune. That's how that happened.
Nice.
I mean, it wasn't something I wrote for Jeff.
Yeah, that's cool. Just something that came out naturally and ended up in there.
Yeah.
Are there any live recordings of that band in that tour? Because that was the first, the Chicago show on that tour, the Chicago Theater, was the first out-of-town concert I went to when I was a kid, and I had to beg my parents to go because I grew up in Iowa. It was about a 3-hour drive to Chicago. This guy who was the guitar guy at the guitar store rented a bus for us, and about 20 of us went to that show.
Wow, it's like a pilgrimage.
It was a total pilgrimage. And I didn't really know much about Jeff Beck, but all the guys were like, I was 15, 16.
Wow.
All the guys were like, trust me, kid, just go, right? And I was kind of at the back of the hall, probably similar to you. And it was the first time I'd ever heard A Day in the Life, ever.
Yeah.
When he pulls that out. And people around me were literally just like looking around like, was this really happening?
Yeah.
And that to me was, there's a few parts opening the show. I think you guys opened that show with What Mama Said.
Yeah. As soon as you say that, I have a flashback of, I had a whammy pedal that's usually set to go down a whole step, and for some reason it was down, and I started it, and it's just guitar and drums, and then when the band kicks in, they're a whole step higher, and I go, oh shit, and then I have to pull it up.
Surprise.
You gotta love live. Day in the Life, his manager said I was the MD, and so I was always thinking of what we could do next, and Jeff always wanted new riffs, new songs, and I had listened to that first appeared on a George Martin tribute, They had a bunch of actors. Jim Carrey sang a song on that, and he did Day in a Life, and obviously it was stunning. And I go, we got to do that, and so we did, and he did it for the rest of his life because it was
Yeah.
such a
That's awesome.
audience favorite.
Every time I saw him, that was one of the standouts of the night when he would
Yeah.
when he would go into that real
Oh.
chaotic section in the middle. You know?
Yeah. You asked if there was a film. Unfortunately, it's not for sale, but you can find it. 1999 Tokyo. They filmed it for TV, and I always think that I haven't seen it in years, but when we did Day in a Life, the second verse, I come in with these lush strings, take it up a step, and you just don't hear it in the mix. It's such a sad, unfortunate trauma for me.
So to cover all these parts, your rig at that time had to be pretty deep. What do you remember what you were playing through at that time? Probably your Washburn, right? I think if I remember right.
Yeah, I played the Washburns for those years. In fact, that was my model. I can't even remember what it's called, but the first gathering after I played the tracks at his house, his first idea for the band was Tony Levin and Terry Bozzio. And so he booked a couple days at SIR in New York for us to get together. And I walked in and I'm like doing a 360 looking for the keyboard player and discovered that was it. So, I mean, Jeff's the kind of guy that jump and the net will appear. Let's just fresh. Let's just make it happen. And after those days, I go, man, all those lush keyboard sounds from all those records, from Blow by Blow, Max Middleton, Jan Hammer, Tony Hymas, you can't come close with guitar sounds. You can make some lush sounds, but it's not going to do it in my mind. And so I had been booked to go to the Frankfurt Music Mesa not long after that. And I walked out of there with, at that time, it was a brand new company with the fastest synthesizer in the world called Axon. So I walked out of there with an Axon endorsement. And I was using I think a Roland converter, analog to digital. And God, there were so many problems with it. I mean, it was fast, but it would, I see my finger on C and I'm hearing C sharp. This is not good.
Yeah.
No.
So at the last minute, the last week of rehearsals, I switched to all Roland gear and all the problems cleared up, but it was slower.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not anything you would want to solo with, although I did a couple melodies with it. Well, gosh, I had to do that in Savoy. There's a trumpet or a horn solo, and I had to be so on top of the beat to make that work. It was a struggle. But yeah, so I had this whole keyboard rig. I had a refrigerator-sized rack with 3 different Roland 1080 modules. It's so old school because now I could just take a laptop and have 10 times the amount of sounds. But I had a couple converters, and then I had all the guitar gear. So I had MIDI switchers for guitar, plus a whammy and a wah and volume, and then I had a volume for each module of the synthesizer, and it's just ridiculous amount. It was 2 people's worth of gear.
Yeah.
I remember Jeff came in one day and he was looking at all my pedals and he goes, "Look, I'm building a pedal garden." And so he brings in 3 little pedals that he doesn't even take on tour.
Because one of my memories from that tour was like, it just seemed like you just had your hands full at all times. I mean, you were just so involved and you're playing these parts and you're trying, obviously getting into it and doing a great job. But at any moment, you could just tell that Jennifer had her hands and feet completely full at all times,
Yeah. I always wish we had one more week rehearsal just for my feet, because I'm a full believer in a lot of repetition to get that stuff so it's second nature, because that's what I learned from Michael Jackson. We rehearsed for damn near every day for 2 months, and there was no question of what's the first chord in the bridge or what sound are you going to use on the next tune. And with Jeff, all the song and the songs were changing until the last minute, and I'm like, I just hope I don't play trumpets when I'm supposed to hit strings.
Now, was there any click with that, or were you all just doing it live? All doing it live, and all your switches were manual?
Yes.
All your patch switches. Any famous slip of the toe stories on that tour where you're all of a sudden a trumpet comes out of nowhere, or did you have it pretty dialed in by the time you got there?
I'm sure there was, but therapy has deleted it.
So let's move up to You Had It Coming. Where did making the next record come from?
The momentum of having a project he was enjoying. His manager said this is the first time he's been on tour where he's not every day on the bus counting how many days are left because he wants to go home.
Yeah.
We were having a great time. I mean, it was a party every day for 3. It was just incredible. 2 bottles of champagne waiting for us after every single show. So I think he would use the term there's more oil in the bottom of that can or something. So he was fired up. He wanted to keep going, and the manager's going, oh, holy shit, we don't want to let this energy go. So they immediately booked, his manager immediately booked a studio in Soho, London, and he booked 2 rooms. So Steve Alexander, the drummer, was writing in one room and I was writing in another. And we were just coming up with stuff and firing stuff off to Jeff. And that became You Had It Coming. And also, gosh, there was the producer, Andy Wright, also had a drum programmer. And he'd have these guys come up with killer sounding grooves. And the guy would come up with something and send it across the hallway to Jeff and Andy, and Jeff would just react and just improv. And that stuff became the melodies, the verse, the chorus, everything. And boy, the speed that Andy was able to just hear, this is going to work here, and cut, chop. I think Jeff was put off a little bit, especially the record that followed that. Jeff was talking shit about it in the guitar magazines. You go, this is a promo tour. What are you doing? But I think the record that followed up, which I was not a part of, I wasn't there to support him. I think he was kind of off on his own and getting insecure about stuff. And I read some articles after he passed that those records didn't sell well. I have no idea how many sold, but Guitar Shop didn't sell it as well as he wanted either. So it's all relative.
Yeah.
Were there tours after You Had It Coming?
Yeah, we did a You Had It Coming tour. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the story of he had commitment issues, let's say, where he would take everything so seriously. He thought if he didn't have the proper title for a song, his career would be over. So he would take just ridiculously seriously, and he couldn't come up with a title for that record. And it got so late that the Japanese promoter Udo, who did all the big bands in Japan, he goes, look, if I don't have a title by tomorrow morning, the tour's off. And so he invited me. Maybe it was just the 3 of us, Sandra, his wife, and me and Jeff were trying to come up with titles. And we're just going, how about this and that and that? And then I probably wrote 50 things down. And he took a break and he went off to the kitchen, and I think he was cooking something. And he looked at his hands, and it had grease under it from working on cars, of course. And he goes, he thought his hands looked like a mass murderer. And so You Had It Coming. It was the perfect title for that moment of him seeing that how gnarly it looked.
That's awesome.
Like he had just killed somebody.
Yeah.
I definitely think that
it saved the tour.
Yeah, right. I don't know if it was maybe just the fact that Who Else tour is so embedded in my mind, but I really felt like that Who Else album really gave him a whole nother life in touring and introduced him to a whole new generation of players who weren't around for the Wired Blow by Blow era. Obviously went back and checked those out, but and it was so surprising to me that this electronic filled album was the one that really brought him back in some ways, Yeah,
well, he's one of those guys, unlike a lot of the guys he came up with, that was always listening to everything, always searching for inspiration. I tell people he could listen to Ornette Coleman and the Spice Girls in the same day, and he would be able to glean something, the snare EQ, something
Yeah.
from everything he listened to, and he never wanted to repeat himself. He got bored really easily. And one of the quotes I read in one of the guitar magazines is, "I'm an unpredictable bastard." And he was. He would take left turns and right turns, and he had a clause in his contract that he had 100% creative freedom, and he took it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
more than so many people, his one record to the next can just vary so much. But then also just like listening to his playing over the course of his career, his it's not just like his vocabulary changed, but his whole approach just changed so many times. And
Yeah.
that always impresses me so much, like how much he could evolve his thing and then evolve, what he's surrounding it with, the production, the bands, that all that stuff. It's just that to me is a real standout in Jeff's work.
Yeah, well, finding your voice never ends. And
Yeah.
plus, as a personality, you change as you get older. And he was always a really sensitive cat. And I think he just got more and more sensitive as he got older. Plus, listening to all these different things, um, he was just, I think, the greatest guitar player on earth that could capture emotion and make the audience feel that. Instead of going on rote licks and here's a groove, blah, 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 he'd take it to another level. And man, I remember he was, we were working out Angel Footsteps. And he was in front of me all the time, and I wasn't seeing his hands. I was just listening. And it was several days before I realized, what the hell are you doing? He took a slide in his right hand and played the second melody over the pickups, where, a
Wow.
millimeter is a whole step. So you
Yeah.
got to get between the millimeter. And he had such a good ear that he was able to do that. And that is treacherous. I mean, that is a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And like that, most guitar players could not come close to that. Where were you? Another one where you take a harmonic and make melodies from the wang bar. You have to have a really good ear to be able to do that. So yeah, he was always. It was all a result of being bored with himself. And I remember one time I was showing him a melody to a tune that we cut. It wasn't used on the record, so I ended up using it on my own, called "In the Aftermath." And I remember showing him the melody, and it was pretty simple. It was in one position, basically, in a box, and he was having the hardest time with it. And I thought, "You're a genius. What the hell's going on?" you know. And what he was doing was interpreting on the spot a better way to make each note sound. So he was all over the board. And moments like that were like, of course. It's brilliant.
One thing I don't think he gets enough credit for is his improvisation ability.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I mean, people think of him as this master melodicist and has this incredible touch and tone. But like when you hear now with YouTube, we have videos. When you hear him play maybe the same song night after night, how he's improvising is incredible. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, he would kind of encourage us to do things differently because it would fire him up in a different direction. But I mean, he's one player that could take you on a ride. You just lose yourself like you're watching a really great movie because everything is so on purpose and not rehearsed in the improv side of it. Um, and you were just feeling his inspiration, telling a story of what he wanted to tell you.
Yeah. So to wrap up, Jennifer, thank you so much for hanging with us and
Sure.
Yeah.
sharing
Thank
your
you.
stories. If you could tell somebody who's never heard Jeff Beck, listen to these 3 Jeff Beck tracks to start with.
Hmm.
What 3 tracks would you point them to?
Boy, I tend to go for the ballads. And so if you're a 14-year-old caffeine drinker, this probably won't work for you. But this is university material here for guitar players. Because we ended as lovers. Goodbye, pork pie hat. and maybe Behind the Veil.
Mm. I'd throw Where Are You in
Where
there.
Were You?
Where
Yeah,
Were You? Yep.
yeah. And that stuff will knock your socks off.
No kidding. The last time I saw him was at the Crossroads Festival in Chicago, the first one, where he played with Clapton, and it was in this soccer stadium, and I was with my Chris Keys, who works with me here, and he had never seen Jeff, and so Jeff comes out and they're playing their set, and he starts playing Nessun Dorma at the end, and all of a sudden Keys looks at me and he's like, I don't know if I've ever seen anything like. He was like gobsmacked. He just could not believe it. I mean, and the whole stadium was dead silent when he was playing that. The whole stadium was. And it was a big enough stage where you could see people on the side, every single guitar player that was there, from Clapton to Mayer to every single one, Warren Haynes, Derek Trucks, they're all along the side. Every single person, that was the set everybody came to watch. That was the set.
Yeah, that's
so
the ultimate. It doesn't get better than that.
No.
Not in my book.
So Jennifer, you're about to go on tour. What's next for you? This is going to come out in, I think, 2 weeks from when we record it. What are you up to for the next couple months?
It's crazy how my life has changed. Your schedule changes because you get an email. Here's where you're going this week. I just went to China 2 weeks ago. The last couple of years, all the Michael Jackson tributes in the world are reaching out, and I'm working with 6 different ones. So I'm constantly on a plane going to different countries. The first thing that's coming up, I'm going to Austria. I'm doing a workshop one day. I'm doing a solo show. I do a solo multimedia show in sync with films that I make. And this is crazy. I am playing with a brass band.
Wow.
I was originally, they said, can you play like 4 Jackson melodies with the brass band? I go, yeah, that's bonkers. I want a video of it. And now they're sending me these polkas with these just too fast to play trumpet solos that they want me to do. And so I was working on polkas last night, and it's just like, how did I get here? And then I got a couple weeks with a new Jackson tribute I haven't worked with, and then there's another one in Italy that's fairly new, that's with an orchestra and horns, and they're getting a ton of work. So I'm booked to the end of 2026 doing that stuff. Oh, wow. And I will say also, I'm starting. Well, I have for the last 5 years. I've been able to carve out the summers, July and August, to be home, because I don't want to miss these months. And I have a 80s cover band that does Toto and Van Halen and Journey that I just adore. It's so much fun, especially when I'm playing Jackson songs for so many months of the year, and then I get to play all this other stuff. And so that's my life at the moment. And I finally got it together. I'm always behind the 8 ball, but I finally got it together so I can record on the road. So days off. I finally found a plugin that I adore. The Line 6. There's an amp called the Line 6 2404. That it's like so I'm neck deep into modeling now. And so people send me tracks and I record when I can.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, you have your work cut out with you with the polkas, it sounds like. So here's to new things. I wish you luck.
Yeah.
I'm sure you got it.
It's that kind of thing. I go, I could say no, and then there's this other being on my shoulder that says, but you've never done it before.
Yeah.
So that's where I am.
But maybe it'll be really fun. So it sounds pretty fun.
It could be my future.
I want to see it. Yeah. I'll be looking for it on YouTube.
Okay. Cool.
Well,
thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer.
All right. Well, that was Jennifer Batten telling a bunch of amazing Jeff Beck stories. The story of her just rolling in the studio for the Crazy Like session. If she only had a battery for her video camera.
Yeah, right.
Is that one of the all-time...
The Batten tapes, that
has to be one of the all-time what ifs, Yeah.
That's a great record.
That is a good record.
I have spent some time with that record this week again. And man, He just sounds so good playing that
The
music.
Live at the Iridium Rockabilly record's really good too. That one I remember I reviewed for Premier Guitar. That was a really, really great one. So
I gotta spend some more time with that one. Then.
all right, so you can get at us. Give us your Jeff Beck hot takes, Jeff Beck stories, favorite tracks. You can email us at 100guitarists@premierguitar.com, or you can give us a ring at 319-423-9734. Send us a text. Let us know how Jeff Beck changed your life. Maybe you were also at that Chicago show. Who knows?
We'd also like to thank Fender and the Player 2 series for sponsoring this episode. Until next time, this is Nick Millivoy.
This is Jason Chadrick. We'll see you next week.